Thank you all very much for coming along. This is what to do with dispute boards and experts. It's a very practical session. I'm moderating. I'm Andrew Aglionby. We've got a really experienced group of dispute board members together to give you their views on some of the questions. So in no particular order and without a lot of introduction, because you've got the bios and you almost certainly know who they are. There's Lindy Patterson-Casey, Brian Barr and John Papworth. And as I say, very experienced dispute board members. And it's a delight to be working with them and to have them to talk about this subject. The use of experts in dispute boards is, it's a strange thing in a way, because dispute boards are not arbitrations or court. They're not the same process. They're a different process, much quicker. There's a whole lot of stuff that doesn't happen in dispute boards, which does happen in other processes. There's not that much time for exchanges of views and not very much time for analysis of hundreds and hundreds of pages of someone else's view and preparation of a response to hundreds and hundreds of pages. So there's a limited amount of time for procedures, but there's still the obligation to give everyone a fair hearing. So, there's a tension there between parties who might want to say as much as possible about topics which really matter to them, and they might want as much support for their views as they can possibly gather from people who don't work for them, and giving the other side a good chance to read it, understand it, and respond to it. So that's what we're talking about today. We've got some preparation which we've done. We've got a list of things which will easily see us through an hour. And the format, we hope, is that we'll be discussing things among the panel. We've got a sort of lead person to talk about things, and then other people will chip in. The other chipping in that I encourage is from you as the audience. And if you know the format, you'll know that there's a question and answer box at the bottom of the Zoom. And if you've got a question and you would like an answer, perhaps you can put your questions in the Q&A box. And I can't promise that we'll get to all of them, but we will certainly try to answer some of them as we go along. So that's the introduction. I think we can move quite promptly then, perhaps to John or Brian. It's John and Brian. To talk about the challenges that do come out of the limited period that we have for the entire DB process. And I would say that, of course, includes the period for decision making and writing it all up as well, which is not an easy thing to do. So, Brian, over to you.
Can I just start, John? Welcome to everyone. For a start off, I'm really pleased to be here and talking. I would just want to emphasize the 84 days. 84 days seems a long time, but it's not a long time if we then start dealing with experts. Now, experts can come from the parties. Each party can produce their own expert, but sometimes it happens that the dispute board themselves need expertise as well. And finding such experts is quite difficult and time consuming. So from a time point of view, it really cuts into the 84 days. And even just getting the report out of an expert within a time to enable the dispute board to then continue on and make a decision would be a major problem, or it can be. So the recommendation is, right at the very start, you need to know exactly how this is all going to go, and you have to get the approval from the parties. The contract requires this, and if you believe if you do need an approval, then best to go for this at the very early stage. Can I pass over to John? Would you like to
Yes,
add?
morning, good afternoon, Brian, and hello to everybody. Nice to see you. A lot of familiar names on my screen here, so if I've not met you before, hello. I think Brian's already made the point here that things can be a bit of a rush. Time tends to go rather quickly when you're doing something useful. And I think that one thing the DB member has to be mindful of is that the referring party comes to this having had probably months, maybe even years to prepare its case. And so the experts will have been living and breathing this for all that time. And that can put the defending party or the receiving party at something of a disadvantage. And you have to really be mindful of that. It's perhaps slightly easier for a standing DB because they'll know what's going on and what the nature of the dispute is. But if you're an ad hoc DB, or you're appointed late, which is about the same as being an ad hoc person, and that's usually, I have to say, the way things work, it's not so easy, and even you as a DB member can find it hard to keep up with things. But I think sometimes you can take a little bit of action here. I mean, for example, with today analysts who seem to have a kind of sub-industry of their own, a good step can be to make sure that they're both working from the same type of analysis and that there's some similarity in the style, at least, of their instructions, even if not the wording. Otherwise, I'm afraid a lot of time gets wasted, and I've seen that happen, and it's not very satisfactory. So that's a start off. What about you, Brian? You got anything more to add, or Lindy, perhaps?
No, that's
just going to pick up on the points that you'd made. I mean, I think one of the difficulties that arise is when different reports or different experts are being relied on than, for example, were submitted to the engineer. Because typically you would expect that the dispute board is going to look at something that has already been circulated, say it's a contractor-employer dispute, that the employer/engineer has received it already. But there will be a difficulty and challenges that arise if the contractor decides that they wish to use a different expert or a slightly different approach. Brian or John, have you had that experience in a referral?
I can't really recollect it, no. What about you, Brian?
Yeah, no, the problem I've experienced is experts put forward by the parties are not independent. I mean, and when you get an expert on each side, you have opposing views. And if this is a very technical subject, I mean, you really need to be on top of your game to go forward with this.
Yes. The other issue, of course, is that sometimes if it's a contractor against employer or owner, the employer or owner has not instructed somebody external and they're relying on the engineer. And then the question is there an imbalance? They may be very upset, the responding party, if they're faced with this huge delay analysis and really they're not able to match it or have not had time to do that. So there are lots of issues, I think, arise with particularly delay and quantum reports. I think with technical experts, it's a bit different. they are probably less cumbersome. Often it will be whether something is a defect or not. And that's where certainly if I was chair, I'd be relying on people like Brian to step in. And I'm just thinking of the situation when John and Brian and I had a site visit when we were in Albania. And you remember we went to site, and Brian in particular had to study the defects extremely carefully. And we were relying on that as the dispute board, really, although I think there were expert opinions, but that's the great thing about a dispute board. You often have a mix of disciplines that allow you to contribute in all different aspects.
Yeah.
Can I make a couple of points? First, Lindy, to get back to something you mentioned, you said what happens if there's a slightly different case that's put. I mean, I think it might be argued that it was a different dispute, but let's put that to one side. If it's the same dispute, you owe me X dollars because the ground conditions were different, but the detail of that claim is expressed differently, and perhaps with, perhaps they recognise that it wasn't put as convincingly as it could have been earlier, and so they got the new team. They've got someone else to explain it. I mean, the DB, does the DB have a discretion not to hear that?
Well, I mean, I have had this argument, and it's a matter of degree, I think. It's never quite clear cut. Is it the same? I mean, if it needs to be the same as has been referred to the engineer, but to what extent then is a party going to sort of nuance it when they get to the dispute board? It's very difficult, and I think one of the key things is to make sure that each party has sufficient time to properly respond to or deal with that. And that's where Brian's point about the 84 days is so important. It's also where I might call a meeting, or we might call a meeting and agree an extended timetable that allows, say, the party that's on the receiving end of something that may be subtly different, time to deal with it. So it's not an easy one. As I say, it does typically arise, I would say, on delay, even quantum. There might be some differences, but I think it really is around delay. If say a contractor is thinking better of what they've submitted through the job and want to do something that they perceive might convince a dispute board more, how far can they go?
Yeah, well, I think it's important actually to give people time, because you won't get the best out of them if they're harassed.
Yes.
And they're being told they've got to have something done overnight, which is about the last thing that anybody should have foisted on them. Everybody does things better when they're in a relaxed state, and what you as a DB want to hear is somebody who's talking sense and is articulate and has had time to give a considered opinion. Otherwise, it's just not fair. It's not fair to the other side or that side or to the dispute board. I mean, it was easy with Brian because, I mean, he just went round and he'd got an experienced and trained eye, and he just told us how good the concrete was. Well, I wouldn't have known that.
So
you remember that.
So just on the fairness point, I'm a lawyer, so we like fairness points, because they're quite difficult to pin down sometimes. So just imagine the contractors develop their claim. They would say it's only fair that you listen to this developed version. You can't stop me thinking about it and expressing it in a way that is more developed, because that would be unfair. And then the DB says, well, let's have a bit more time for the employer to look at it. And the contractor might say, but it's 84 days, why do we need to have more time? Is the DB going to say, you can't change your claim if you don't give us more time? Is it or do you never get to that stage? Is it, how does that work?
I think you offer the other side a chance to have their say. But I think that what we all need to remember is that what the parties are paying for is the decision. And if you feel that you need more time to make the highest quality of decision, then I think you have to be frank with people and say, no, I'm sorry, I can't work miracles. If I just might refer to some bundles that I've had a few years ago, somebody told us there was 100,000 pages in the bundle to look at. Well, I don't know who counted it. And even recently, I've since learned that there were 95,000 pages. Well, sorry, but that can't be done in 3 months.
Certainly my experience is that if you approach the parties and say, look, more time is required, generally this is accepted.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only about one case I remember where the one party was pushing for the decision to be made quickly, mainly because it gave him an advantage. But that's a rarity. I mean, most people, most parties are very flexible on the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think probably they're realistic, and if the dispute board considers that more time is needed, they will in the main. I agree with you, Brian, they will in the main agree with that. I mean, the important thing is to watch that the number of days for us to write the decision is not the one that's completely compressed, which sometimes happens.
Yes. That is the problem, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So we've got a question from Cyrus, and I think it goes back to something Brian said. So Brian, you said if the DB realizes that it needs experts, then right at the beginning, you need to know that and you need to manage it. And Cyrus says, if you realize early enough that you need an expert, who drafts the terms of reference for that expert? And I wonder if he's thinking there of the DB appointing its own expert.
Yes, I'm sure he is. Yes, and it happens. I mean, yes, the dispute board has to have experience and knowledge of the subject of the contract and whatever the contract is building. Now, let's say there's a bridge structure with post-tensioned tendons involved. I mean, and there's a problem with that. You're talking about a very particular experience that not normal dispute board would have. And in that case, if an issue were to crop up on something in that order, you would most certainly have an expert on from both parties, who inevitably will disagree, for sure. And so how do you resolve that? You really need to go to the parties and you need to say, look, it's allowed is that you appoint an independent expert of your own. And that takes time, of course. Again, another pressure on the 84 days. But that happens, yes.
And then who would draft the terms of reference for that expert?
Well, that would be the dispute board to draft. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a good point actually about the decision making. You've got expert one who says it's black, and expert two who says it's white. It is one of the questions that party representatives always ask themselves is what are they going to do with that? What's the dispute board going to do with that? Is it going to be black? Is it going to be white? Or how can they mix it together and come up with some sort of grey? And then is it light grey? Is it dark grey? How do you get to a decision? Brian, I'm going to go to you because you've got a slide.
Yeah, well, this shows you a dispute board in that situation. Yeah. I mean, this is, well, the fact is, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I would not take on a dispute board, say, in the nuclear energy sector or something of that order. But for civil engineering works, I mean, I'm not an expert on, as my example of was tensioned concrete, but I certainly know the procedures. I certainly know the calculations, and I can follow a calculation. I can't say I could sit down and write one out, but I could certainly follow a calculation, and I would therefore be in a position, if you've got two opposing positions, I would hope that on the projects that I am actually on the dispute board on, I would be able to clarify the situation and make a decision.
Lindy, perhaps I can go to you on the same question.
What I would say is when it comes to delay and quantum, it is often grey. It's not the black or the white, because it's often a matter of degree. How much are the prolongation costs? How much critical delay? And I think, again, just picking up on Brian's point, the mix of experience on the dispute board is usually, in my experience, sufficient to allow us to deal with that quite readily. Yes, I mean, John may be up late the night before issuing the decision, doing the number crunching, but you know, that is the way of it. When it comes to technical experts, I think that is a bit more difficult in finding a grey area. You know, if you have two experts, one says it's a defect and one says it isn't. Quite often you need to analyse what's in the contract and what the contract requires, and then apply the opinions to that. Again, just picking up on the point Brian's made, I mean, I've not had, as I can recollect, a situation where we've had to appoint our own expert. I think I've always had a situation where our board was able to analyse what had come in from the experts and to discard what we didn't agree with and adopt other parts of it. But it's a challenge, and again, as Brian says, it takes you back to the amount of time that you have.
John, did you have any extra thoughts on that one?
Well, you know, I think if you can't understand something, the thing you do is ask questions, and I think sometimes it's a matter of knowing when to ask the right questions, not questions for questions' sake, but if somebody's going through something in the specification and he says, "Oh, it means this," and you say, "Well, excuse me, can you explain why you think that?"
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the parties themselves, they need to make their position clear, and if it's not clear, as John suggests, you ask the question. Yes.
And I guess that's where a meeting comes in, or meeting or hearing, whatever you want to call it. That you've then got the opportunity, if not before then, to ask these questions.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point. Alfonso had a question, which is, in managing the process, does the DB ask the parties at an early stage, perhaps on receiving the referral, if either parties will request a hearing and if they'll have experts?
I can do that. 0.5%. And I asked for an expert on VAT in a third world country. And I tell you, I don't know anything about VAT.
Good point.
I've got an accountant. He's very good at it. But, yeah. Okay. And so, but just in thinking about the procedural directions, would you raise this early, or would you wait to for the party to raise it? What do you think a good practice is?
Well,
Um,
firstly, sorry,
oh,
Brian, go
No,
ahead.
you go, Lindy, go, please. Yeah.
I was just going to say that you will know when you get the referral and if there are experts, because the referral will have the expert reports with it. And then you're going to know, I would say in general terms, whether it's something that you can deal with without appointing someone else. And I absolutely agree with Brian if it's VAT. Even some of the tax, I mean, there are a lot of tax disputes come up, and that's another one that can be a tricky one. My experience is that most parties do wish a hearing, and because most of them are online now, there's perhaps less concern about cost.
I think Alfonso raised the point very much to do with being early in the piece and a hearing or meeting. Well, firstly, I think it's always best to get things sorted out early anyway, so that people know what they're doing and the things go in the diary, and you know that they're going to turn up in the right place at the right time. The other thing is when you have people in front of you, their behavior, I think, can be very important. If they're confident, that's helpful. If they're overconfident or they don't know what they're talking about, neither of those is very helpful. And I think that sometimes when you've seen somebody produce things on paper, it's quite different from when you actually get to meet them.
There's a question from Barry Tozer about hot tubbing or concurrent evidence from expert parties. Is that something that you come across in hearings?
Yeah. Recently, quite a big one, actually. It was a long DB. I mean, it was years, but that's what the parties wanted. And it was very helpful, actually. And we could ask people direct questions and look them in the eye and test them when they said, oh, can't do that. Said, well, come on, that's on the internet. Of course you can do it. Linda's nodding. So I've got something right anyway.
It's sometimes said that favours the best performer rather than the best expert.
Andrew, I think we can see through that.
Lindy, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
Not to impose arbitration procedures on dispute boards. And that is where obviously hot tubbing, the references to hot tubbing come in. The fact is that a dispute board hearing is way more flexible than an arbitration hearing and should be. And the dispute board should have every opportunity to ask not only the experts directly questions, but the engineer, the project manager, without lawyers getting in the way of that. And that is the big thing and the big advantage of dispute boards. So yes, I mean, sometimes you're involved in disputes that feel like mini arbitrations, even although they're being referred to the dispute board. But we have to work hard to get back to the principles of dispute boards. And for example, directions, there's no such thing in a dispute board. You don't issue orders. You can agree a timetable, but we don't deal with it in a formulaic way, the way that I would suggest arbitration is dealt with.
Can I just add there?
Yeah.
If it's a standing board, I mean, one of the first things you do, the initial meeting, there's no dispute at this stage, and you set out, I call them guidelines, they're not rules. I make it very clear, these are guidelines. And the guidelines cover many of these issues, certainly about timing, certainly about presentation of information. And if you're providing large volumes of information, you need it presented in a way that you can actually access. So, I mean, for instance, the PDF files have to be searchable. I mean, that's one little item which can save many hours of work when you're working on a decision. So when these disputes do come up, a lot of these issues that we're discussing about transferring data and methodology of the hearing and all this can actually be agreed right at the beginning.
So I'd like to move on a little bit and perhaps picking up a topic that Ismail has raised. He says, in introducing the experts in the dispute boards, are we not moving towards arbitration? And so perhaps we can answer that by just having a look at experts. What are they good for? You know, why would you have them? Lindy, I've moved on to, in our format, point 2, and point 2A, I think is they're good for giving an opinion. And I don't know if you had any more you might want to say about that.
Well, I typically, I know I keep coming back to this, but they're used for delay. You may find you have people submitting reports. They've been involved in the project. They may be external, but they've been involved in the project for a year, maybe more. They've prepared reports previously. So, I mean, what's important is that they help the dispute board to understand and analyse the issue. And in delay, certainly from my standpoint, some sort of analysis is of course extremely helpful. I mean, there need to be underlying facts that support it. I mean, if the contractor was denied access to the site or part of the site for a few months, the contractor is going to have to confirm that that is truly the case if it's challenged. So it is a mix of expert opinion and fact from the people that were on the ground.
Any thoughts on that, John? You popped up on my screen, so you made a noise. So there you are.
Oh, sorry. Well,
That's fine.
I do apologise if I talked across somebody just now. I didn't mean that. No, well, I think Lindy's covered that perfectly well, really. There's not much more I could add. I think my next port of call would be the one on auditing of available material, really.
Just before we leave Lindy's point on, you know, she mentioned, I think, delay and also earlier quantum and having an opinion from those people. At the very end of this session, there was all the preparation for it. There was a question: what do you do as a DB if you don't have experts? And just thinking about delay for a moment, you'd have, I suppose, you'd have the contractor's claims, whatever they said. You'd have the referral to the engineer's decision. That material would probably all be available. The contractor's claim may or may not have been prepared with the benefit of some expert opinion. It probably wouldn't include it. Might do, but probably wouldn't. So if you didn't have someone who came along and said, you know, I've been doing this for 35 years and this is how I think it works. You know, I've read the SCL protocol on delay. I can tell you what the recognized approaches are. This is the approach. This is what matters and why. If you didn't have that packaging, where does that leave you as a DB?
Is this just on delays?
Well, as an example, to test.
Well,
what are they for?
I'm a fairly simple sort of chap, so I tend to take a rather simple approach to all these things. The criterion in the FIDIC books is what prevented the project from being completed on time. A lot of people draw in all manner of bits and pieces of delay at somebody was late painting a bit of pipe or something like that. Well, I mean, what you really want to know is what actually delayed the job. And very often the people who who know it, they might not want to admit it, but the people who know it are the ones who've been on it from A to Z. And that's usually the contractor's site manager and the engineer's senior resident engineer. And it's the people like this you need to get in front of you and say, look, come on, no messing about now, no hidden agendas. Tell me what you think delayed the project. You've worked in this industry 35 years. I've worked even longer than that. So please tell me.
Brian, what do you think?
can be presented with a very sophisticated delay analysis. Yeah, that's at one extreme. At the other extreme, you get a piece of paper with a few lines drawn on it. And my experience is I've very rarely had a proper delay analysis. I don't come across them very often. Let's put it like that. So generally, you're dealing with limited information, and this is where you need to speak, as John says. You need to know the people, and it's one of the advantages of the standing board. You know the project itself, so you just have to make a decision based on the information that you have. Yeah.
And you will have progress reports, that sort of thing that's been submitted through the project. So there's usually lots of information. So I certainly would not say that you definitely need experts in that situation, but you need enough information. If you've been attending meetings for a few years prior to that, you'll probably have quite a good feel for what's causing the delays.
Thank you very much. John, you started to talk about auditing of available materials, so I'd like to come back to you on that if I can.
Yeah, well, I suppose the word audit immediately brings in the quantum part of it, which is an area that I do get involved in, and being inquisitive, some people might say a bit nosy, but I really want to know, the figures from the grassroots. And I think a DB is entitled to expect somebody who calls themselves an expert to know where to look for the relevant and helpful information. I mean, what we call the old days, it was bits of paper, and that was all quite hard going. But nowadays, people have folders with names within that. They've got files and so on. You know roughly where to go. And if it's not there, you go and ask somebody, where is it? I think sometimes it's a case of managing that information, and Excel is a great program for doing this. And to start with a list of what everybody's got might be useful. Then you've got a bit of a start, and decide what's going to be most helpful to you, and question the authors of that material. And the other thing, when you get the proverbial 100 or 98,000 odd documents, maybe some kind of sampling needs to be considered. If it is it 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 100 bits of paper or documents? We don't talk about paper, do we? And do it on an agreed basis. And that's to me is important. And
that strikes me again as a time function as well.
Yeah, it is.
Brian, I think there's a related point about having some sort of ability to access large amounts of information. John's just touched on it, but if you've got 100,000 documents and say you're a sole DB member, you need some help, don't you?
You do, yes, yeah. What do you expect? Well, I'm going back to that initial meeting that you have at the start of a standing board, and you make it clear what you want. But essentially, you need to get your data organized, and an expert, particularly if you're even an expert from the parties, an expert from the appointed by the DAB, you need to make it very clear that he's there actually to make a complex situation simpler. Something that you can understand. It needs to be understandable, not just by the dispute board, but it needs to be understandable by the different parties. It needs to be organised, logical, and accessible. And these days, of course, we're working offline, aren't we? And that in itself creates a problem. And there's nothing worse than you're under pressure and you're trying to download a file, and things start to go wrong, don't they? It's always the case. But all of these issues really need to be sorted right at the start. You know, how are you going to transfer information? Is it, I mean, I sent out a 20 megabyte document quite recently. The email server I used didn't inform me it was too large. So I just assumed it had gone. Now, if that had been a decision, I mean, I would have been in serious trouble. So you need to be aware of all these issues. And if you're going to start using third-party file transfer facilities, you need to be aware of the security risks as well. So these are issues that are normally sorted out at the beginning. Yeah, but an expert, what he should do for you, he should narrow down the critical points that need to be answered. So from my point of view, wherever this expert is being employed, I am expecting something to be narrowed down and focus on what actually is required. Pinpoint the core issues. And it just allows you to then concentrate on the main, the main decision. Who's actually at fault here? Yeah. So that's anything else from anyone on that one?
No.
So narrowing areas of disagreement. So you got your 100,000 pages. How many issues are there? What needs to be decided, yes or no? And if you decide something yes, what does that mean? If you decide it no, what does that mean? It sounds very simple.
Yeah. Well, it makes it sound simple, doesn't it? But when you start layering all the issues which are not relevant, really, but there's many of them, it's a time-consuming task to get down to the actual issue, which is the problem. And this is where experts, if it's a particularly difficult and technical issue outside or on the edge of where your knowledge should be, then this can be really useful. Yes.
Are we back to a hearing there, or is there some other way of the DB interrogating that?
Well, a hearing is another way of a hearing is you're gaining the same sort of information as a hearing as an expert. Yeah. Yeah.
I think, Andrew, here is where a standing board is, it can be shown to its best advantage, because you know the people and you've known them perhaps for months, even years, and you know who's causing trouble and who's likely to cause it and who you can rely on to be a bit more sensible. And I think that if one is sensible, one can actually arrange a site visit at or around the time that you'd normally have a hearing anyway, and combine the two, so that cuts down on cost and time. And also, I think the word hearing can actually create the wrong impression. It's almost as though you've got people in a situation where you're going to attack them, or somebody's going to attack them and feel nervous, whereas you get people in their normal domain, which is the site office, which is where I started working. They're going to be a bit more relaxed. And the other thing is, actually, if you're at site, nobody has got an excuse for saying, well, I can't find that document. Well, you can, because, this is where you work. It must be here somewhere. And if it's not here, you can find it by email to somebody.
I've often tried to find things in Aconex, and I usually ask someone else. So, there's a question I'll just deal with now. So, if the DB does appoint an expert, who pays? Is it chargeable to the project and split between the parties? How does that work?
Well, I mean, when I had, I think there was about 3 days input from a VAT expert. Yeah, I paid, and that was then invoiced to the parties, so the parties pay eventually.
It's the usual way.
I think if there was a very, very large input, I think a DB would negotiate with the contractor to get the contractor to foot the bill first.
Yeah, yeah, because normally costs aren't allocated by the dispute board, are they, to one party or the other? Each party normally bears its own costs. So,
That's
would
right.
it would split
Yeah, I
it.
would think that the contractual way would be for the contractor to actually foot the bill, and then he would recover half the cost.
Okay. Any other points on narrowing areas of agreement, disagreement?
Well, not really. I think if you're a standing board, you know those anyway. Should do, if you've been reading the material.
So let's move on to things which can go wrong in the use of experts, and let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that experts can be helpful. Let's start there, but let's also assume that they're not always helpful. So we had a think. I had a think earlier. Sometimes it's difficult to know what the evidence is for. I say evidence; it's not evidence. Apologies. It's information given to the dispute board. What's it for? What's the point? Lindy, I'd suggested you might say something about that, so I'll come to you.
What's the evidence for? I guess I've not really had that situation. I suppose you can have a case, as everybody has identified, where the reports are enormous, and it's somehow for the board to get to the heart of it. But again, just picking up on the benefits of a standing board, you will normally know where you're expected to go with these reports. Preferably, these reports will have an executive summary. I would invite one if I don't get one from the parties or the expert. But I think usually I would say I would know what the expert, or why they were being deployed by one of the parties.
Okay, let's move on. John, the importance of independence in an expert, how important is that?
Well, it's quite interesting, this, Andrew, and everybody. I find that the statement by experts that they're aware that they owe a duty to the tribunal is infallibly included in the opening paragraphs of, or in an appendix to, the expert's report. But the reality is equally infallibly different. It's also obvious to a tribunal that they've been given a job to do, and there isn't anything to be gained by straying into advocacy. Any DB who knows what they're doing will pick that up. I actually find this quite objectionable, really, that people do this, because I belong to the RICS. It's a chartered body, and we are bound to give independent advice. And I'm actually quite sad that really people start just objecting to other people's views or arguing with them, almost for the sake of objecting and arguing. And if you think that's going to impress the board, well, it'll probably have the opposite effect. I think there's a matter of professional courtesy and respect. If somebody really does have an opinion, then don't just object to it. I mean, the other person might be right, and you'll come out of it far better by saying, Mr. So-and-so is right. Perhaps I wasn't clear enough, or I got it wrong, and it's better to do that then and then. Otherwise, it's going to backfire on you.
Brian, what do you
Yep.
think? Independence?
It's it's something that it's something which is stated at the start, and if you dig, you find there are links, and you find that independence is not what it seems. Yes, and that works on both sides, of course. Yes.
So back to the one says it's black, the other says it's white. What sort of shade of grey can you get from that?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's leading me on to this, when one side says one thing and the other side says something else. And, it's, if it's a small difference, so what, you can handle it. But if it's a large divergence, then it's a major issue, isn't it? And you've really got to know what's being talked about. And the last time this happened with me, it was on a foundation design, and I'm a lot better on foundation design than I am on VAT. So I had an answer to this, but clearly there was one party there which was providing information which was quite well. I won't say false, but it was certainly manipulated, and it certainly wasn't right. So there is a big problem with this, of getting independence, and I suppose it's one of the strengths of the DAB, isn't it?
Can I ask?
We are completely independent. Yeah.
I got two questions about that. One is, if everyone expects the game to be rigged, and unexpectedly someone comes along who's completely honest, how does that fit into the expectation of a rigged game? No.
Well, it doesn't, does it? I mean, yeah, the rigged one has got an advantage in that position, and that's strengthening the position of the DAB. Yeah, it's entirely down to the DAB in that situation. And if you're really knowledgeable and understand the project and the contract, then it should be solvable. Yeah.
The other question is, say an expert's dealing with 5 issues, and you just think that they've been an advocate for one party on issue 1. Does that automatically affect their credibility on issues 2 to 5?
I would say not automatically, but it might.
Yeah.
This industry, like a lot of others, is made up of people, and people can be unreliable. And if you put them in different environments, especially when their opinions are being tested, I won't say attacked, but tested, then their demeanor can start to change.
It can, and I'm very conscious that I've just been testing you all as practicing dispute board members, and I apologise that I hadn't meant to put you in a testing position. So, and I should say, for the benefit of the audience, that very kindly everyone's agreed to discuss things, but when I ask them a question, they're giving views which encourage discussion. So they're not telling you what their answer always is for every situation, just to be clear. Lindy, we hadn't asked you about independence.
Well, it's an age-old issue. The fact is these experts are being paid by one party. So we're all aware of that. That is the reality. The good experts realise, however, that what is important is for their credibility with the board, that they present things as honestly and openly as they can. Trying to conceal anything, one, would not go down well, and two, it would undoubtedly be discovered in one way or another. There are, of course, nuances on it. The way that things are presented can change overall impressions, but I think it's just something that we're aware of. It's the same in arbitration. You know, I think if the board is experienced, we will know, I think, who we properly rely on and understand. And I keep coming back to the point as well, is that people that were on site at the time are absolutely key in anything. There is no point in having some fancy 6-volume expert report if you have nobody to back it up who was on site or who can talk in general terms about the issue. And that's particularly the case with delay, maybe slightly less with quantum, but this is all based on the facts.
So what's your preferred way of receiving those facts then?
Well, usually you get it in witness statements. I mean, not always. As Brian and John have both said, you'll have probably heard from many of the parties at the site meetings. And if there is a hearing, which is likely, and things have not been said, you can just ask the individuals concerned.
So I've got a question from Levent. He's asked 3 questions, but I think we dealt with 2 of them. The last one is about what do you do if the expert turns out to be a close friend or colleague of a DB member?
Well,
Now, Levent, I did read your questions. Well, I mean, if that's the case, of course you must disclose that immediately. But I mean, I haven't had that experience. Brian, John, have you had that?
no, I think actually if that came out in the wash, I'd be inclined to say to the said DB member, you must have known this from the moment this person's name came into the ring. Why didn't you say something in the first place?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, sorry, Brian.
Yeah, you know a lot of people. That's the problem. But that doesn't affect. Just knowing somebody does not affect anything. No.
I think the obligation to protect the process, isn't it? And so disclosure at the very least.
Yeah, it's also a case of being seen to be independent, not just being independent. You need to show it in some way. And if you know somebody, you make it clear. You make it very clear. And I mean, what I do is every meeting, which is 3-4 times a year, on a standing board, I will make it clear that my independence and my situation is unchanged, you know, and that is made clear to the parties.
That's a good point, yes.
Well, sometimes it changes. So if you know, I mean, some of these contracts go on for 3, even 4 years.
Yeah.
And your situation of being unattached can change.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
It caught me out once, and I thought, right, okay, the way to solve this is to include it into the minutes of into the agenda, the standing board meeting. Yes.
yeah, especially as if it's a contract that's running over a long time, there could be quite a lot of contract managers come and go, for example. So you're right. Yes, keeping it up to date. Yeah.
Well, I'm conscious that we've reached our time. I'd just like to say that was excellent. Thank you so much to all of you for participating so well and so honestly and helpfully. And we're going to leave it there. Thank you all very much to everyone who's attended and for your interesting and helpful questions. So thank you very much.
And thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.